Stories about America to read aloud. Number 13, A Doll on the Oregon Trail. Now, Jessica, said Polly, it's time for your nap. When you wake up, maybe we'll be across the mountain. For a moment, there was a worried look on Polly's face. Oh, I hope we'll be across that high old mountain, she said. Carefully, she wrapped a small pink blanket around Jessica and laid her on the bed. Polly was a little girl, 6 years old. Jessica was her doll. Polly had picked the name because she thought it was the prettiest one she had ever heard. The time was long ago, and the bed was just a cot in the back of a covered wagon that was bumping along the Oregon Trail. The wagon belonged to Polly's parents. It was one of the many in a wagon train that stretched a mile long. The people in all the wagons were moving west to start a fine new life in a fine new land. They were going by covered wagon because that was the only way to travel to the west in those days. There were no paved highways then, just a pair of wagon ruts that led across the prairies and through the towering Rocky Mountains. The Oregon Trail was the first trail west and the longest and greatest of them all. Packed in a wagon in which Polly rode was food and clothing and furniture and farm tools, everything the family would need in its new home. An ox team pulled the heavy load. Oxen are strong, short-legged, slow-moving beasts that look something like cows. Suddenly, Polly's wagon stopped. Outside, she could hear the voices of her parents. Pa and Mama had been walking beside the wagon. Pa was saying, I'm sorry, but we've got to do it. There's no choice. Polly climbed down from the wagon. She saw that all the wagons were stopped at the foot of the mountain. The people were taking out boxes and furniture and stacking them beside the road. Suddenly, Polly was frightened. She crouched in the mud behind a big wheel to hide. We've got to unload the wagon, get rid of every extra pound of weight, Pa was telling Mama. Everything must be left behind but the food and clothing and our beds and the farm tools. I've got to keep the tools to put in a crop when we get to Oregon. But not my best dishes, Mama cried. Now, don't fret. Pa patted Mama's shoulder. We'll get more dishes someday in Oregon, but we've got to lighten this load. The animals are tired and footsore. They can never pull us across the mountain the way we're loaded now. If we don't get across the mountain, we'll never get to Oregon at all. We'll be trapped here. Mama tried to smile. I'm sorry I made a fuss. It's just that they're such beautiful dishes, and we've already brought them so far. But you're right, we must lighten the load. Polly watched, round-eyed, as Pa took the box that held Mama's best dishes and set it off at one side of the road. Then he took their extra bedding and most of their pots and pans and even their one chair and stacked them beside the dishes. All around, other people were unloading their wagons too. They all looked very sad, especially Mrs. Stanley, when she took a picture out of her wagon and set it against a tree. It was a lovely picture of a castle. Polly knew how much Mrs. Stanley liked it. Then Polly looked up at the mountain. It was tall and jagged and steep. Could the poor, tired oxen drag the wagon way up there? Polly shivered with fear. When Pa finished, Polly crawled back into the almost empty wagon. Jessica still lay wrapped in the pink blanket. Suddenly, a dreadful thought struck Polly. Mama's dishes, Mrs. Stanley's picture, Pa saying everything must be left behind, but the food and clothing and beds and tools. Oh, Jessica, no, whispered Polly, not you. But even as she said it, she knew what she must do. Jessica was a doll. She wasn't food or clothes or... There were tears in Polly's eyes as she took Jessica and climbed down from the wagon. Pa and Mama had gone up front to the oxen. Nobody was watching. Tears made everything look blurry, so Polly couldn't be sure, but she thought she saw Jessica nod her head. It was as if Jessica were saying, It's all right, Polly, I understand. We have to lighten the load. I don't mind staying behind if it will help get the wagon across the mountain. Polly hugged Jessica tightly. Then she wrapped the pink blanket closer around the doll and laid Jessica carefully on top of Mama's box of dishes. Goodbye, Jessica, Polly whispered. I'll never forget you, and I'll love you forever. Then Polly climbed quietly back into the wagon. She stayed there all day beside Mama, while Pa and the oxen fought to get the wagon up the steep mountainside, and her arms felt lonesome without Jessica to hold. She remembered all the good times they had had together since the trip began, months ago. They had seen Indians along the way and prairie dog villages. They had thrown snowballs in the high mountains in midsummer and sung and danced at night around the crackling campfires. There had been buffalo meat to eat and frost-ripened berries. There had been wild rivers to cross and fish to catch. Sometimes at night under the big starry sky they had heard wolves howling. At times the oxen plodded knee-deep in mud. Other times the trail led through fields of wildflowers. Polly had once picked the blossoms and tied them to the oxen yoke. And now Jessica would never see Oregon. Polly gave a little sob. What is it? Mama looked very tired and her voice sounded scratchy. Mama had offered to climb the mountain on foot, but Pa wouldn't let her. No, he had said, it's too dangerous for you now. You rest all you can. Polly didn't want to worry Mama now by telling her about Jessica, so she just said, it's nothing, Mama. Pa had a hard job. Sometimes the oxen staggered, and sometimes Polly held her breath when she felt the wagon teeter as if it were going to roll back down the steep slope and crash at the bottom. But at last they were across the mountain and safely down the other side into the wide, peaceful valley. There the wagon train stopped to rest. My, how good it felt to Polly to get out of the wagon and stretch her legs. If only Jessica were here. We made it, Pa shouted joyfully. He grabbed Polly in a bear hug. But I'll tell you something, and Pa looked at Mama. It was touch and go there for a while. I wasn't sure the oxen could make it. If we'd had another feather's weight in that wagon, we would have been stuck forever in the mud on the other side of the mountain. Then I'm glad I left Jessica behind, said Polly slowly, because she weighs lots more than a feather. Left Jessica? Pa and Mama stared at Polly. Polly nodded and told them how Jessica had stayed behind to lighten the load. Mama put her arm around Polly. My brave little girl, said Mama. For the first time since she had kissed Jessica goodbye, Polly began to feel a little better. That night a strange thing happened. Polly was too sleepy to understand it, but she knew Pa moved her to Mrs. Stanley's wagon. Next morning he came after her and took her back to Mama. Mama, very pale, was lying on the cot. Beside her was a bundle, something wrapped in a pink blanket, almost like Jessica's blanket. Mama smiled at Polly. Come see your new sister, she said. A sister? Polly crept closer to the cot, and Mama turned back the blanket a bit so that Polly could see the tiny face of the baby. She's like a doll, gasped Polly. Oh, Mama, is she really mine? Yes, said Mama, and she's a lucky baby to have such a brave big sister. Can you guess her name? What? Breathed Polly, still staring at the beautiful baby. Mama reached out a hand and took Polly's. Her name is Jessica, said Mama softly, and when she gets big, we'll tell her the story of the other Jessica, the dear little doll who stayed behind on the Oregon Trail so that the rest of the family could get safely across the mountain. Oh, Mama, said Polly happily. Oh, Jessica. Then she realized she didn't know which Jessica she meant, but it didn't matter. She did know she would love both of them forever.